G'day trendsetters, welcome to episode 6 of the Wabi podcast. Today I'd like to address the question, is tea a religion? I guess I'm curious about this question because I consider myself a deeply spiritual person, even religious, and a lot of the people that I consider very close friends within the world of tea have very strong doubts about the possibility of a spirituality and religion. And also, there's a famous phrase in the world of Chanoyu, or the Japanese tea ceremony, Chazen Ichimi, or tea zen, one flavour, which purports to say that the way of tea and the way of zen are one and the same thing. That might be a little bit too far. I mean, the proof is in the wagashi. We can already see that there's a lot of tea practitioners that don't necessarily practice zen, and vice versa. So we could say at least that by saying Chazen Ichimi, we're trying to say that the way of tea is a concrete manifestation of Zen mind, whereas Zen focuses on introspection, tea is a way to express that mind in the everyday lived world. And this may or may not necessitate a dual practice of both tea and Zen. Let's have a look, polish the floor, grab a tea, and tune in. Rotary ho, so we should come clean right at the start and say that Chanoyu, or the way of tea, owes its very existence to Zen Buddhism. And why that is because the monk Myoan Eisai in 1191 reintroduced the practice of tea drinking to Japan after he come back from a study trip, a Buddhist study trip to China, and he brought back the tea rituals that were included at that time in the monastic practice of Zen monasteries in China. Tea had already made its way to Japan long before, and the first record that we have of tea being practiced in Japan, or tea being drunk in Japan, is in the 800s, I think, don't quote me on that, from the Kojiki or something like that, where tea was offered as part of a Buddhist ritual to the emperor. Or was it? Anyway, in the Kojiki, or one of those books like that, there's a record that tea was offered to someone very important and also an audience of around 50 people. So whether tea was imported or grown in Japan at that time, we don't know, but it was there and it was part of a Buddhist ritual, the very, very first record that we have. And then after this time, tea plants were invested in Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples in order for the monks and priests to cultivate tea from then on. So from the get-go, tea was very deeply intertwined with religion in Japan. And this relates to one of the points that I like to make often, which is that the chemical constitution of tea is quite conducive to what we would consider a spiritual mind state. So you have a lot of caffeine and L-theanine in tea. One is a stimulant, one is a relaxant, and they counteract in the body after you imbibe tea to produce a mind state that sustains a very long, calm concentration, rather than some of these energy drinks or coffee that brings you up and then sends you down in these peaks and troughs. Tea keeps you in a focused, calm mind state for a long period of time. And you can see that this is immediately transferable to Zen meditation. Zen monks sitting in long periods of meditation, getting the nods, some falling asleep, have some tea, and lo and behold, you can get a deeper sense of awareness into that introspective mind state that you're exploring in your meditation, and hold that focus and concentration for long periods of time, which is required in Zen monastic practice. So tea, as in the chemical constituency of tea, and the practice of Zen Buddhism go together very well. And Eisai was a bit of a mover and shaker, and he had very good connections to the upper echelons of society, namely an audience with the shogun and folk like that. And he thought that this beverage tea, and he also bought tea seeds back, and he started plantations all around Japan to cultivate the plant, because he had a very deep belief that this thing was not just good for Zen monks and monastic practice, it was also good for common folk. And he promoted this idea to the shogun. He wrote a whole treatise on tea called the Kisayo Joki, or tea drinking for health and well-being, or something to that effect. And he gave a copy to the shogun and said, "Have a read of that, mate. What do you reckon?" And he said, it's not a bad idea. I reckon we should get into this thing called tea. And then all the samurai jumped on board underneath the shogun, and tea drinking as a beverage for health and well-being became quite popular through the upper levels of society. And gradually it spread down to the common folk. Anyway, cut a long story short, Eastside believed quite passionately that the physical effects and the spiritual effects had great benefit to both Zen practitioners and lay people. And the history of tea in Japan has proven Eisai right. But I've just dropped the S-bomb, namely the word spirituality. And some people have a problem with this word and spirituality in the tea ceremony. Now, looking at a tea ceremony, it's quite overtly a spiritual practice, but some people that practice tea do not like to consider their practice spiritual or religious. And so I want to have a look at this question today. To come clean at the onset, my tea practice is a deeply spiritual practice, but rather than the spiritual aspect of my practice being a bad thing or a good thing, I want to make it quite a neutral thing by exploring the hell out of it. Spirituality for me pertains to the non-material aspects of our existence. So that means it's associated with our quest for deeper meaning in life. So some people are quite happy with the bare facts of existence that we can ascertain with our eyes, namely the materiality of our everyday life. And when we die, that's it. But other people, and probably most people, would like to hope there's a bit more to this gig called life, and that there's a lot of things that we don't exactly know for sure that are existing at the same time that we do that have an impact on our lives. And we'd like to find out what these things are, whether it's through introspection or science or religion. But spirituality, as opposed to religion, is at first something deeply personal. And it can take on many forms. Meditation is a great first example. A lot of people practice meditation without being religious. Even Zen meditation, you can sit in the Zazen posture, face the wall, and just sit in quiet contemplation without holding any mantra or Zen riddle in your mind. You can just be there, just experiencing, concentrating on your breath in and out, calming yourself down, and enjoying the benefits that go with this meditation practice. It doesn't have to be overtly religious. But the aspects of this practice that makes it spiritual is that you're connecting to the inner qualities of yourself that you don't usually explore in your everyday life. So you're shutting out the normal stimulus and the normal reasoning and processing of your mind and just stopping it for a sec and seeing what's there underneath all this everyday noise. And this usually brings about a greater sense of peace with oneself and one's surrounds. So you can quite happily hold a meditation practice and even go to a Zen center and practice meditation with Zen practitioners and not buy in to the religious aspects of the practice. I would think that there's quite a few people that actually do this. Another big one is yoga, and it's not just yoga. You can think of things like Tai Chi and Qigong and even Feldenkrais. This is not just a physical exercise, it's also a deeply spiritual practice for many people that harmonizes mind and body. I know for myself, I've been dabbling at all different things like Tai Chi and yoga and Qigong for many, many years. And recently I've landed on quite a solid yoga practice. And I find this has enhanced my teaching by way of clarity of mind, my thinking, the way that I concentrate and the way that I practice my tea. And also the physical aspects of my tea practice. So my Caesar, sitting in the posture for practicing Chana Yu, and the way that I recover from long periods of sitting in Caesar has been greatly enhanced by the practice of yoga. And I notice the effects on my mind and body through practicing yoga so much that I'm almost addicted to practicing yoga before I go off and do a solid 6 hours of translation or writing in the library. The difference between the clarity of mind that I have before I practice yoga and after is incomparable. Another big one, which pretty much everybody will be able to relate to in some aspect, is the experience of nature and connecting with nature. This can be as simple as looking at a sunset or sunrise, going for a walk in the forest. There's a beautiful word in Japanese, shinrin-yoku, which means bathing in the forest. In this very word is a recognition that when you plonk yourself in the depths of nature, you get some sort of physical and spiritual effect from being in nature. And when we contemplate the sunset, there's the thought that, wow, there's something in this gig called life that transcends my own life and my own self. And it gives us a sense of connection with something eternal that we don't usually focus or concentrate on in our everyday goings about. And art and creativity. Art can be a deeply spiritual experience for both the viewer of an artwork and the creator of an artwork. And why that is because art is usually aimed at evoking some sense of beauty and also moral ideas. And there's a certain universality to those ideas of beauty encapsulated in artwork, and also the moral impact of the work. It touches on our sensibility about the deeper themes of our life, i.e. the ethical and moral, and there's a certain universality to those themes. Don't attack me on the universality of moral and ethical claims. That's a whole other topic in and unto itself. But anyway, I think there is a certain universality to the way that human beings experience beauty and the way that we conduct ourselves as moral and ethical beings. And in modern times, science has actually come to the party and proved a lot of the things that we formerly considered spiritual to be actual measurable effects on our lives. So for example, in tea, before we practice tea, we clean the chashitsu. And my Grand Master in Pearl Among the Clouds talks about the act of cleaning. Doing some cleaning in the morning can remove all the things that are built up in your mind that you cannot get rid of during a good night's sleep. Just by cleaning your house or a small part of your house every morning, it helps to move on those blockages and the gunks and all that stress and thoughts that you don't need to have an impact on your day. And science has proven this, that by doing acts of cleaning and putting your surrounds in order, the concentration and the clarity of your thinking is enhanced. Another example that we do in the tea ceremony is purify our hands and mouth before we go into the tea room with water. Now this has been a practice in Shinto, the religion of Shinto in Japan, for hundreds if not thousands of years. And there's a deep sense that by cleaning yourself with water, you're opening yourself into a deeper connection with the non-material aspects of life. But on the scientific level, cleaning your hands is a very hygienic practice. And even though we don't remove as much bacteria as we do with soap, it still does allow us to clean ourselves and not defiled by impurities or bacteria that might make us sick. And there's also been many scientific experiments done on meditation practice and yoga practice, and they've all proven what people have known for eons, namely that these things bring about very positive effects for the health, the physical health of the human being. They enhance concentration, they enhance clarity of mind, they improve flexibility and remove stress. All these things have been measured by science. And tea drinking in itself, what I talked about at the very outset of this podcast, namely that the chemical effects on the body can be measured. The caffeine and the L-theanine and the stimulant and the relaxant can be measured. And we know what people have known for thousands of years, that this has a very positive effect on human consciousness. But there's even some more out there ideas that are starting to be proven through scientific verification. One such example that I think is extremely interesting is quantum entanglement, which takes two photons, or light particles, which are derived from the same source, and they're separated by distance, and this implies by time, so by time and distance. And without touching one of the photons, but interacting with the other one, both photons react in exactly the same way at exactly the same time. So this implies that no matter the distance and time that these particles are separated, effects can transcend time and space. And whether this is related to quantum entanglement or not, I'm not sure, but something that comes to mind when I think of this experiment is my own experience of practicing tea and researching about tea for many, many years. So by embodying the forms of practice and achieving a certain depth in the forms, I feel that I unlock a certain knowledge and I don't know where it comes from. So whether I'll leave that last bit in the podcast or not, I don't know. But if it's there, you know that I've had the guts to say that out loud. So spiritual in the context of Chano-yu, the Japanese tea ceremony, relates to the non-physical, subjective, emotionally and psychologically meaningful aspects of the practice, which are very individualised. So people may say that they feel a certain type of serenity when they're in the tea room sharing tea with people. They might say that it's very meditative. They might say that they feel a deeper connection to nature. They might say that they feel a connection with other human beings that they don't usually feel on an everyday basis. There's a certain holistic effect of tea practice that seems to transcend the mere physical benefits of practicing tea. People might be very emotional and they might find that when they're in the tea room, they form a deeper connection with their mind of reason and nature, and that balances out their emotions and creates a holistic effect. And people that are very cerebral might find that when they're in the tea room, they can connect deeper into their emotional lives, and there's a certain connection formed with heart and mind that seems to transcend the mere physicality of making and drinking tea. But there will still be people that want to say that no, there is no spiritual aspects of my tea practice. I just enjoy participating in the forms and the physical architecture of preparing tea in a ceremonial fashion and flexing my artistic and creative muscles by decorating the tea room, and that experience for me is not necessarily one that's transcendent. Or the deeper connections that I form with myself and other people through that activity does not necessarily have to be something that I can't couch in words. It doesn't have to be something that's beyond the materiality of the present moment. And if you want to interpret it that way, rock the house. I have no problem with this interpretation. In the past I certainly did, but I'm quite accepting of this interpretation as long as those same people are accepting of my spiritual interpretation of my practice. I think they are equally relevant. But is tea a religion? To address that, we should look first at whether Zen is a religion. Some people purport to say that Zen is not a religion, or they like to practice Zen and think of it not as a religion. I would put myself in this group of people for the past how many years. But recently, the past few years of my practice of Zen, I've come to be a lot more accepting of what I think the reality is that it is in fact a religion. I've taken my Zen precepts, the Jukai. This is a set of ethical precepts like the Ten Commandments in Christianity. There's others in Zen Buddhism like the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path. These sets of things are characteristic of religions. They're guidelines for practitioners to follow in their lives. Tea can be seen as having these too. We have Wake Seijaku, harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. They're a lot more vague than the Ten Commandments or the Zen precepts, but they are still rules to live by and contemplate, which give structure to the practitioner's life. And some people may interpret holding these sets of values as a religious practice. Another thing that's characteristic of religious practice are rituals. And of course, Zen Buddhism is steeped in different rituals. So offering the incense is one example. The tea ritual was originally a part of Zen monastic practice. It might not be observed as much today as it was in the past, but it certainly lingers on in some traditions. And probably the reason that it's not practiced so overtly in Zen monastic practice is because it exists in more formalised tea practice like the tea ceremony nowadays. And the urgency isn't there like it was in the past. And rituals like the Japanese tea ceremony are up for interpretation. Some people may look at a Japanese tea ceremony and think that what is happening is something religious, and other people may not. And certainly some practitioners may hold that what they're doing is something of religious significance, and other people would be vehemently against the idea that what they're doing is anything associated with religion. Different people will look at rituals and have a different interpretation. Institutions and clergy are another big characteristic of religions, and Zen, of course, has this. There's a very well-defined structure in a hierarchy of different temples and the different sects of Zen Buddhism in themselves. And actually, tea schools share this. So, for instance, in the case of my tea school, the Ueda Sokoryu, there's certain levels of sensei. There's 2 shihandai, which operate directly under the Grand Master, which are higher than myself and some other sensei. Then there's the Grand Master right at the top of the pyramid. So there's a very well-defined hierarchical structure in tea schools. For religious organisations, climbing up these structures usually require some sort of ordination ceremony. But in tea schools, there's also a gradual progression through diploma levels, and some of these have overt ceremonies associated with them. So in my tea school, when we get the highest level of qualification, the ceremony is conducted in front of a Shinto shrine, where a sculpture carved by Ueda Soko is enshrined. So there's perceived to be some sort of link with the founder of our school. And in Urasenke, for example, when people receive their next qualification level or diploma, this is usually presented from the sensei sitting in front of an alcove with a picture of Rikyu, the founder of the Senke schools of tea. And so, from somebody looking from the outside, these acts can look quite religious. Zen, along with other religions, share soteriology, which means that they are aiming or promise some sort of transcendence. So in the case of Zen, it's enlightenment. In Christianity, it's salvation. There's a transformative goal at the ultimate end of practice. There's certainly a transformative goal in tea practice, i.e. to create a deeper harmony between mind and body and the positive physical effects of practicing and sharing tea with other people. But whether that's as inflated as with organised religion is a question which I don't think tea lives up to. I don't think that tea promises any sort of salvation or transcendence in the way that organised religions do. Zen Buddhism has devotional aspects, i.e. you put a certain faith in the Buddha's teachings that what he taught the world is the truth, and you want to delve into the deeper aspects of this truth, and you're devoted to that practice and the words of the Buddha, or the teachings of the Buddha. It's not just the Buddha, there's also ancestors in the lineage of Zen, which we have great reverence for in our tradition. And in tea, we also have quasi-religious things like this, like for instance calling Rikyu the tea saint. And certainly the way that Rikyu is revered and thought about in Japan is creeping towards a borderline religious phenomenon. And not just Rikyu, many other founders of tea schools. So the way that we think about Ueda Soko in the Ueda Sokoryu might not be overt in the sense that we call him a saint or anything like that, but certainly with the example I gave before about having our qualification ceremony in front of a Shinto shrine with objects that he carved, there's a certain sense of a transmission of knowledge that transcends space and time, and that could be considered religious. But at the same time, you don't have to buy into that idea. You could just say that it's nice, and it's a nice ceremony, and there's a sort of nostalgic meaning to being connected to these old artifacts created by somebody with whose practice you are interacting with at a deep level. It doesn't have to take on this religious aspect, although from an outsider it would look overtly religious. Religions usually have a defined set of texts and teachings, and that's with all the sutras that we have in Zen Buddhism, and also koan study. There's certain collections of koans, which are riddles that we have to solve in our meditation practice. And this is a characteristic shared across religions. Also, tea schools would share this characteristic as well. So we have, for instance, the Nampo Ryoku could be considered a seminal text in the way that Rikyu's tea is transmitted. There's also other records like the Yamanue Sojiki, or the diary of Yamanue Soji. We can derive teachings and insights in the way that tea was practiced, and we try to replicate them now and learn by them. And the last aspect is community, or in the case of Buddhism, Sangha. There's a community of practitioners in whom we have faith, and that faith revolves around being able to confide in our community members and practice in confidence and relate our experience with this community and help us along to the next stages of our practice, or help us through rough times of our practice. There's a shared identity and a collective spiritual endeavour involved in Sangha and religious communities. And you can see that this is immediately transferable to tea schools, whether it be Amote Senke, Ueda Sokoryu, Seki Shuryu, Ura Senke, Mushinakoji Senke, Sansai Ryu. There's definitely a collective identity that's formed with tea schools. So for me, the three aspects that I've talked about just then, which I think makes Zen a religion, are the institutions and clergy, the community or Sangha, and the defined set of scripture or texts. And I've described that these are certainly relatable to the way of tea, or the practice of the Japanese tea ceremony, Chana-yu. There is a defined hierarchical structure of the community, the institution of tea schools. There's a certain body of texts and teachings that are passed on throughout the ages. And there's a community grouped around different tea schools that have a certain identity, even a spiritual identity. So these three aspects that make Zen a religion are also aspects that tea shares. But this is making tea sound like it's a religious practice. And of course it can be if you look at it this way. But I don't think that you can hold tea and pin tea to the religious definition. There's a degree of religious and spiritual expression which does not necessarily have to be part of tea practice, but it necessarily has to be part of Zen practice. And so if you put those aspects aside and try and define religion, or define what is religious, I like the definition by James C. Livingston. Livingston says, "Religion is that system of activities and beliefs directed towards that which is perceived to be of sacred value and transforming power." Religion is that system of activities and beliefs directed towards that which is perceived to be of sacred value and transforming power. So committing to one's Zen precepts, practicing Zen meditation, and delving deep into the literature of our tradition is something that's aimed towards personal transformation. That idea of enlightenment or deeper awakening to the truth of reality. So whether you interpret tea to be a spiritual practice or a religious practice, or reject both those ideas and practice tea as a non-spiritual, non-religious practice, will probably come down to the way you interpret this famous poem in The Way of Tea, the tradition of the Way of Tea. The way of tea is naught but this. First you boil water, then you make the tea and drink it. Now for you, that poem may be completely void of the smell of religion, but for other people, this same poem could be a gateway to a spiritual life of immeasurable value. Many people get uncomfortable with the idea that something very important to them and deeply personal like tea practice could be considered religious, with all the jumps in logic and leaps in reason that religious belief implies. But perhaps we'd be a little nearer towards emotional health and ethical good sense if we weren't so allergic to the idea of these things, i.e. our tea practice, being somewhat spiritual or religious. It might make us a little kinder towards the ideas going on in the minds of other people. Thanks very much for listening. If you'd like to subscribe to the mailing list for this podcast, follow the link in the description. You can sign up to my Patreon for free or paid to get on that list. If you'd like to get some tea, grab it through my website. If you'd like to learn tea, please contact me via message through my website. If you'd like to buy the Pearl Among the Clouds book or some of my artwork, you can get that via my website and the link in the description. Please share this podcast about if it's doing you some good. Funk Wabi.